Before airport security learned that attacking a legend has consequences, they thought an elderly man would be an easy target. This is the story of how one word from Clint Eastwood turned their arrogance into a career-ending nightmare. "Get out of here, old man." Airport security officer Mark Thompson's foot landed a hard kick to Clint Eastwood's back. In 2021 at Los Angeles International Airport, the 91-year-old legend was simply trying to board his flight. But the officers didn't recognize him and saw only an elderly man. When Clint hit the ground, he said just one word. That word changed their lives forever. It was a humid Tuesday morning in July 2021 when Clint Eastwood arrived at Los Angeles International Airport for what should have been a routine flight to San Francisco. At 91 years old, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his mind remained sharp and his dignity intact. He was traveling alone, having politely declined his assistant's offer to accompany him. This independence, which had defined his entire career, was about to become the catalyst for an incident that would expose the worst of human nature. The airport was particularly chaotic that morning. COVID-19 restrictions had created confusion and frustration among both staff and passengers. Security lines were longer than usual, and tempers were running short. Several flights had been delayed, and the customer service desk was overwhelmed with complaints. In this atmosphere of tension and disorder, 3 security guards were having the worst day of what would soon become their final week of employment. Mark Thompson, the senior guard, was a 34-year-old former mall security officer who had been hired by LAX just 6 months earlier. He carried himself with the swagger of someone who had finally found a job that gave him real authority, and he wasn't shy about using it. His colleagues, Dave Martinez and Kyle Rogers, were younger and less experienced, but equally eager to assert their power over anyone they perceived as vulnerable. The 3 men had spent the morning dealing with difficult passengers, and their patience had worn thin. They had already had confrontations with 2 elderly travelers who had struggled with the new digital boarding procedures, and their supervisor had criticized them for not maintaining better control over their section. When they saw Clint approaching their checkpoint, moving slowly and carrying an old-fashioned leather bag, they saw an opportunity to reassert their authority. Clint was dressed simply in dark slacks, a button-down shirt, and a light jacket. He wore no jewelry or expensive accessories that might have identified him as someone of importance. To the untrained eye, he looked like any other elderly traveler navigating the complexities of modern air travel. His boarding pass was for a first-class seat, but that detail was easily overlooked by guards who had already decided he was just another senior citizen who would probably cause problems. What Thompson and his colleagues failed to recognize was that they were looking at a man who had commanded film sets for 6 decades, who had stared down some of the toughest people in Hollywood, and who had built a career on never backing down from a fight. They saw frailty where there was actually strength, vulnerability where there was unshakable resolve. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become legendary for all the wrong reasons. The trouble began when Clint approached the security checkpoint with his boarding pass and identification. The digital scanner that was supposed to read his documents malfunctioned, displaying an error message that suggested there was a problem with his ticket. It was a technical glitch that happened dozens of times each day, usually resolved within minutes by calling a supervisor or manually checking the passenger's information. But Mark Thompson was not in a problem-solving mood. He looked at Clint with undisguised irritation and spoke in the tone typically reserved for unruly children. "Sir, there's an issue with your ticket. You need to step aside and wait." Clint remained calm, his voice measured and polite. "What seems to be the problem? My assistant booked this ticket yesterday and I received confirmation." Thompson's response was immediate and hostile. "I don't care when it was booked. The system says there's a problem, so there's a problem. Step aside and wait for a supervisor." The wait stretched to 20 minutes, then 30. During this time, other passengers moved through the checkpoint without incident, but Clint was left standing in a corner like a scolded child. When he politely inquired about the delay, Thompson's colleague Dave Martinez snapped at him to be patient and stop complaining. The situation deteriorated further when Clint asked if he could speak to a manager about the delay. Thompson interpreted this reasonable request as a challenge to his authority. "You think you're special? You think you deserve different treatment than everyone else?" Clint's response was classic in its restraint. "I just want to understand what the problem is so we can resolve it." This calm reasonableness seemed to infuriate Thompson even more. In his experience, people either cowered before his authority or erupted in anger that justified harsh treatment. Clint's dignified persistence fell outside his understanding of how these confrontations were supposed to go. The breaking point came when Kyle Rogers, the youngest of the three guards, returned from his break and was briefed on the difficult passenger they were dealing with. Looking at Clint, he made a comment loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Great, another entitled old guy who thinks rules don't apply to him." Clint turned slightly, meeting Rogers' eyes with the steady gaze that had intimidated far more imposing men than this young security guard. "I haven't asked for special treatment, I've asked for competent service." The words were spoken quietly, without anger or aggression, but they landed like a slap. In that moment, the three guards realized they were dealing with someone who wasn't going to be easily intimidated or dismissed. What happened next would be captured on multiple security cameras and cell phone videos, creating an indisputable record of one of the most shocking displays of authority abuse in airport history. The escalation was swift and brutal, transforming a minor technical issue into a physical assault that would haunt everyone involved. Mark Thompson, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment from Clint's calm but cutting response, decided that words were no longer sufficient. "You know what? I've had enough of your attitude." He stepped closer to Clint, using his size and position to intimidate. "You're going to move along right now, or we're going to move you." Clint stood his ground, his voice remaining steady despite the obvious threat. "I'm waiting for a supervisor to resolve the ticket issue as you instructed. I haven't done anything wrong." That measured response was apparently the final straw for Thompson. In a move that shocked nearby passengers, he placed both hands on Clint's shoulders and gave him a hard shove backward. The 91-year-old man stumbled, but managed to keep his footing, his face showing surprise rather than fear. "I told you to move," Thompson snarled, his professionalism completely abandoned. Dave Martinez and Kyle Rogers, perhaps sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control, should have intervened to de-escalate. Instead, they chose to support their colleague's aggression. Martinez stepped behind Clint, blocking any retreat, while Rogers moved to his side, creating a triangle of intimidation around the elderly man. "Maybe he needs help understanding," Martinez said with a cruel smile. It was then that Thompson committed the act that would end his career and create a legal nightmare for LAX. Without warning, he drew back his right leg and delivered a vicious kick to Clint's lower back. The impact was powerful enough to send the 91-year-old man tumbling forward onto the hard airport floor, his leather bag spilling its contents across the terminal. The sound of Clint hitting the ground seemed to echo through the terminal. Nearby passengers gasped, several pulling out their phones to record what they couldn't believe they were witnessing. A mother covered her young son's eyes. An elderly woman began crying. For a moment, Clint lay still on the cold floor, his breathing shallow, his face pressed against the polished concrete. The three guards stood over him, Thompson with his hands on his hips in a gesture of conquest, Martinez and Rogers looking suddenly uncertain about what they had just participated in. Then, slowly, with the careful movements of a man who understood his physical limitations but refused to be defeated by them, Clint Eastwood began to push himself up from the floor. As Clint Eastwood slowly rose from the airport floor, brushing dust from his jacket with the measured dignity that had defined his 6-decade career, the entire terminal seemed to hold its breath. Blood trickled from a small cut on his forehead where he had hit the ground, but his eyes remained clear and focused. The three security guards stood over him, Thompson still wearing a smirk of satisfaction, Martinez and Rogers beginning to look uncomfortable as they noticed the growing crowd of shocked passengers recording the incident. Clint straightened to his full height, despite the obvious pain in his back from the kick. He looked directly at Mark Thompson, then at each of his colleagues, his gaze moving with deliberate slowness. The silence stretched uncomfortably as passengers, airport staff, and even other security personnel stopped what they were doing to watch this unprecedented confrontation. When Clint finally spoke, his voice carried clearly through the terminal despite being barely above a whisper. He looked Thompson directly in the eyes and said one word. "Really?" The single word was delivered with such perfect mixture of disappointment, disbelief, and quiet authority that it seemed to pierce straight through the armor of arrogance the three guards had built around themselves. It wasn't anger, wasn't a threat, wasn't even an accusation. It was something far more devastating. It was the reaction of a man who had seen the worst of human nature and couldn't quite believe he was seeing it again. In that moment, something shifted in the terminal. The passengers who had been recording began to murmur among themselves. A flight attendant who had been walking past stopped dead in her tracks, her hand flying to her mouth as she recognized the man who had just been assaulted. A TSA supervisor, drawn by the commotion, took one look at the scene and immediately reached for his radio. Thompson's smirk began to fade as he noticed the changing atmosphere around him. Martinez took a step backward, suddenly aware that dozens of people were staring at them with expressions of horror and disgust. Rogers looked around nervously, beginning to understand that something had gone very wrong. But it was too late for second thoughts. The video footage was already being uploaded to social media. The witnesses were already pulling out their phones to call loved ones and reporters. The TSA supervisor was already calling for backup and management. Clint Eastwood's single word had done what hours of argument and protest could never have accomplished. It had stripped away all pretense, all justification, all possibility of explaining away what had just happened. Three grown men had just brutally assaulted a 91-year-old man, and that one quiet word had made it impossible for anyone to pretend otherwise. The recognition began slowly, then spread through the terminal like wildfire. It started with the flight attendant who had stopped to stare, her face going pale as the realization hit her. "Oh my God," she whispered, pulling out her phone. "That's Clint Eastwood." Within minutes, the murmur had become a buzz, then an uproar. Passengers who had been casually recording what they thought was just another airport incident suddenly understood they had witnessed something historic. Social media exploded as videos of the assault began appearing on every platform simultaneously. The three security guards stood frozen, the weight of their actions beginning to dawn on them. Thompson's face had gone from flushed with anger to pale with dawning horror. Martinez kept looking around as if searching for an escape route. Rogers had begun backing away from the scene entirely, as if physical distance could somehow separate him from what had just happened. Airport management arrived within 5 minutes, led by Terminal Director Sarah Chen, whose face was a mask of professional crisis management, barely containing personal outrage. Behind her came a parade of supervisors, security chiefs, and legal representatives, all moving with the urgency of people who understood that their careers might be ending in real time. "Mr. Eastwood," Chen said, her voice carefully controlled, "I cannot begin to express how sorry I am. This is absolutely unacceptable, and we will make this right." Clint, now seated in a wheelchair, brought by paramedics despite his protests that he was fine, looked at her with the same steady gaze he had given Thompson. "Ma'am, I'm less concerned about me than I am about how your employees treat people who don't have cameras pointed at them." That statement, captured by the still recording phones, would become one of the most shared quotes of the year. Meanwhile, the three guards were being escorted away by their own colleagues, their badges and radios already confiscated. Thompson was shouting something about just doing his job, but his words were lost in the chaos. Martinez and Rogers walked in stunned silence, beginning to understand that their lives had just changed forever. The paramedics insisted on taking Clint to the hospital for evaluation, despite his continued protests that he was fine. As they wheeled him toward the exit, passengers spontaneously began applauding. It started with a few people, then grew until the entire terminal was filled with the sound of respect and support for a man who had shown more dignity in defeat than his attackers had shown in victory. By the time Clint's ambulance left the airport, the story was already national news, and the three security guards were about to become the most hated men in America. Within 24 hours of the assault, the 3 security guards had been terminated, arrested, and charged with assault on an elderly person. The video footage, viewed over 100 million times across all platforms, had sparked a national conversation about respect for elders, abuse of authority, and the power of dignity in the face of cruelty. Mark Thompson, Dave Martinez, and Kyle Rogers found themselves unemployable, their names forever associated with one of the most shameful incidents in airport history. Their social media accounts were flooded with condemnation, their personal information was published online, and they received thousands of messages expressing disgust at their actions. Thompson's attempt to justify his behavior in a local news interview only made things worse, as his lack of remorse further outraged the public. LAX faced immediate consequences as well. The Federal Aviation Administration launched a full investigation. Multiple lawsuits were filed, and several major airlines threatened to reduce their operations at the airport unless significant changes were made to security protocols. The financial impact was estimated in the tens of millions of dollars. But the most significant change was cultural. Clint's single-word response, "Really?" became a rallying cry for anyone who had ever been mistreated by petty authority figures. The word appeared on t-shirts, bumper stickers, and social media posts. It became shorthand for the kind of quiet dignity that refuses to be broken by brutality. Clint himself, true to character, declined to participate in the media circus that followed. He issued one brief statement through his publicist. "I've been knocked down before. The measure of a man isn't whether he falls. It's how he gets back up and what he chooses to do next." He donated the substantial settlement from LAX to organizations supporting elderly veterans, asking only that the money be used to ensure that other seniors wouldn't face the kind of treatment he had experienced. Perhaps the most telling aftermath was what happened to airport security nationwide. The Eastwood Protocol was implemented at major airports across the country, requiring additional training on respect and de-escalation, mandatory body cameras for all security personnel, and zero tolerance for abuse of authority. The 3 men who thought they could kick a legend and walk away learned that some actions have consequences that extend far beyond the moment they're committed. They had revealed their true character in that terminal, just as Clint had revealed his. The difference was that his character could withstand scrutiny. In the end, one word had been enough to remind the world that true strength doesn't come from the power to hurt others, but from the dignity to respond to hurt with grace. Have you ever witnessed dignity triumph over cruelty? Share your story in the comments below.
Don't forget to hit the like button if you liked the video and subscribe if you want videos like this to come. See you in the next story.